Hey guys, Keith here. All right, time for another release update video. It hasn't been one for a little while, so this time we're covering releases 2019.4 through to 2019.9. So a bunch of releases, and it's the early part of the year. There's been a bunch of change, a bunch of follow-up stuff around 3D, fixing some things up and adding some new stuff. So let's go through it. So let's start back with 2019.4, and as usual, I'm just going to run through the enhancements. I'll do all the xLights ones first, and then I think I'll come back and do the xSchedule ones at the end. There haven't been many of them, but there's a couple there. All right, so the first one is relates to layout and layout in 3D. And it's just a small change that Gil made so that when you're rotating your house around and then you press the metal mouse button, you move it, that it respects however you're looking at your property, the pan moves, which just makes it a little bit more obvious. Prior to 2019.4, the pan didn't adjust like that, and it was a little bit difficult to use, so that was an update. In 2019.4, Dan introduced the new Ftp Connect Dialog. You get to it via the Ftp Connect menu item here, and it goes out and it discovers all of your FPP instances. I don't actually have my FPPs on right now, but if I did, it would go out and discover them all and list them all for me here, and it would show me all the sequences down here that I could upload to it. There's a bunch of enhancements in this. I'm not going to go into in detail because Dan actually put out a video that kind of went through this and explained what was going on. So I'll just point out some key features. You can add manually add an FPP if for some reason it doesn't discover. And once this is up here, there's a bunch of checkboxes and the like that will appear up here. And so you get a fair bit of control about what gets uploaded to what. The vision that Dan has is very much a situation where you just push the data that you need to push to each controller. So sitting behind the scenes and not incredibly obvious just in the user interface, Dan is pushing out just the channels that each controller needs. He's also compressing stuff, so files are now smaller. They only contain the data that they need. And it's able to deal with much more complicated configurations of FPP controllers. So it's a pretty good enhancement for those who are running either just one or multiple FPP, either players or controllers. So that's that one. Keyboard shortcuts to sequence save dialog. That's a pretty simple one. That was Scott, I think. Yeah, it was Scott. What he means by that is, actually, I think it's when you just close the sequence. If I make this dirty, I'll throw something down here. It doesn't really matter what. And if I file close it, I think this is where it is. He's added keyboard shortcuts to this, I believe. Yes, I just press D and it discards. So a little change there to make it a little bit easier. Okay, so next is the cube model, which was introduced in 2019.4. So that's this icon up here. It needs a little bit of work. You just click and drag, and you can see this is the first of our actually truly 3D models. It's basically a matrix with the pixels laid out behind one another, like so. It has some pretty complicated wiring patterns that it supports, and I'll try to explain them. This is also really good for any prop where you're going to have things laid out in a regular rectangle. So I know that some people have been getting into these stakes, and if you're going to lay those out in the matrix, the cube model could be a perfect way to model those. The starting location, there's actually 6 of them, recognizing that there are 6 corners of the cube. Front, bottom left's here, front, bottom right's here, top, front right's here, and so forth around. So you get to choose whereabouts you start the wiring. Most people, I imagine, will start at the bottom somewhere, so one of the bottom corners. You then get to choose the directions, and the directions, there's a few of them, right? There's 4 of them. So the first part, horizontal or vertical, says that, okay, so starting from the first pixel, which way does it go? So it either goes up and down, or it goes left to right. Or horizontal, sorry. And it might go horizontally this way, or it might go horizontally that way, but it goes horizontally. So you're either going up and down, or you're going across this way or across this way, which is horizontal. And then once you've gone one direction, so let's say you go horizontally. So, okay, we know we're going horizontally, but which way do we go first? And the answer is front to back. So that means that effectively it's starting here and going to the back. And then it will come up and come back and up and back and up and back. And then progressively across left to right. If it's horizontal left to right, that means it's going to start here and go across here and up and across and up and so forth all the way up. And then it's going to step back to the next layer, and it's going to keep going around again, and it'll jump from the top to the next row. The zigzag controls the strands, so it's probably easier to imagine where you're going up and down. So if you're going up and down, the zigzag means that having gone up and down, it would go to the next one, whether it's this way or backwards, and then it would come back down again. That's zigzag. So you're wiring up your cube as a zigzag. You don't have to. You can say no zigzag. If you say no zigzag, then every wire starts from the bottom and goes up the cube. And then there's this alternate pixel. And that's kind of neat, because what that will do is it will start down here, for instance, and it will go from here. It'll skip one and come up to here. It'll skip one and come up to here. Then it will come back to here. Then it will come back to here. And then it'll go across to the next one. So if you're you're running a lot of stakes in the lawn, etc., and you want to connect them all together, that's a kind of nice way to do it, because you don't have the pigtail coming out the top and then having to run it back down to the ground and across to the next one. You alternate up, alternate down, and then it comes out the bottom again and goes to the next one. So how can you visualize these? And the answer to that is, as usual, the node layout. And the node layout's a little bit hard to read. And the reason it's a little bit hard to read is because it actually has the 5 layers of this 5-layer cube laid out alongside each other. So the front of the cube is these 25 cells here, then the next 25 cells are the next layer back, and so forth. And so to give you an example of how that works, let's say I decide to start here at the front pixel. I'm going to go up alternately and then down, and then I want to come across to here and so forth all the way across. So I'm going to start at the front bottom left. I'm not going horizontal, I'm going vertical. And after I go vertical, I'm going to left to right. So up and then down, and across to this one, up and then down, across to this one, up and then down, and then across to this one, and so forth. So if we have a look at the node layout for that, here's node 1. It skips over 1 and goes to node 2. It skips over 1, goes to node 3. There's node 4, there's node 5, and then there's node 6 next to it. Right? Does the same thing all the way up. When it gets to the end, which is node 25 here, notice that node 26 is actually all the way over here. And what that means is, having gone up this last side here and come back down again, rather than jumping all the way back to here, it just goes to the next row behind and goes up and down, and it works its way back left to right. And that's also really cool, because that means that you obviously don't have to run long runs of pigtails to get all the way back to here. Now, if you want it to come all the way back to here, you just click this all layers start in the same place. And what that means is, the layer is the front set of pixels. Well, the next layer, because this one starts in the bottom left, the next one's also going to start in the bottom left. And so if you look at the node layout for that, node 26, right, is right here in bottom left of the second layer, instead of being over here where it was in the other one. So it actually, when you do the math, it turns out there's about 184 different wiring patterns that cube supports. So I'm pretty sure as long as you don't do something really strange, you're probably going to find a way to do it. One of the disadvantages of these models is that it's actually kind of hard to do things like submodel and everything else, because a lot of those dialogues at the moment don't really support 3D very well. But you can actually submodel them. Just remember, if you're submodeling them, oh, sorry, node layout, just remember that this is the shape of the buffer, and so when you submodel it, you know, if you submodel this into 5 equal pieces, then it would actually create a separate submodel for each layer of the matrix, of the cube. The other thing that's really cool about the cube is what happens when it comes time to sequence it. Because I find the fire effect works pretty well. I think it was cube 3 that I was actually working on. And we'll put this into 3D mode so we can see the cube. Does look kind of cool. All right, there we go. Okay, so one of the things about the cube is that unlike most models outside of model groups, there's usually only this default per preview single line and as a pixel render styles. But you can see that the cube has got a whole bunch of additional render styles, and they represent different ways of creating the render buffer based on the pixels in the cube. So if you take, say, stacked X horizontally, and it's a little bit, let me go back to layout, unlock it. Let me grab this, let's bring it forward. Just a little easier to see. I need to make my screen bigger. It's a little bit hard to tell. But what that's essentially doing is stacking the layers horizontally. Stacked X horizontally. So it's kind of hard to describe, but what it's actually doing might be easier to describe on here, because the X-axis is, this is, whoops, again. Because the X-axis runs this way, stacked X horizontally actually creates that long, so the horizontally tells you that the buffer is laid out like this, i.e. all the things are laid out horizontally. And by X, what it means is that it's taken each of the layers, if you look at it from this side over here, the left-hand side, that first layer is going to be the first set of pixels here, and then the next layer is going to be the next set, and then the next layer is going to be the next set, and so on across. And the reason it's called X-axis is because this is the X-axis running this way, and so it's taking it along the X-axis. If it was taking it along the Y-axis, it typically does it from the top, so it would be the top layer looking down, followed by the next layer looking down, followed by the next layer looking down, and so on. And if it's Z, it's front to back, and that happens to be the default buffer layout. Right, so that's how the stacks work. They create those long horizontal stacks of the pixels, all laid out slightly differently. Vertically is the same, except instead of a wide, 25 wide node buffer and 5 high, it creates a 25 high and a 5 wide, so it lays it out slightly differently. The overlaid X, notice how every layer of the cube seems to be doing the same thing, and that's because what it does is it takes every layer of the cube and puts them right on top of one another and paints on it like it's painting on every layer simultaneously with the same data. And so you've got 3 of the overlays as well. The unique X and Ys, this one's kind of hard to visualize, but if I come back to my layout again, it actually creates a buffer layout that's 25 wide and 25 high. And what it does is the front layer will be hit here in the bottom left-hand corner with the first 25 nodes. And then the next 25 nodes, instead of being next to these 25, will actually be just up here and to the right. And then the next lot will be just up and to the right of there. And so there's this diagonal where the nodes are, and all the rest of the matrix that we're rendering on, or the buffer that we're rendering on, is empty. And so that can create, again, some, you just basically get slightly different appearances of the effects using the different buffer shapes. The left-hand side's kind of interesting because what it does is it just renders on the left-hand side of the cube. So here we're looking at the front on just here, and this is the left-hand side over there, and it's rendering there. But you can also render on the right-hand side. You can render on the top, and it creates a buffer containing just the nodes in that layer. So yeah, a whole swag of different buffer layouts to enable you to get more out of your cubes. And that kind of makes it somewhat more powerful than just putting a bunch of matrices into a group and saying, well, that's my cube. So a fair bit to go on there. All right, some other things. Okay, value curve flipping. Best way to show this again with the fire effect. Okay, so if I come up here and I create a value curve, I don't know, we can just do a ramp up down, we'll be fine. You now have this button here called flip, and what it will do is it will actually flip the value curve around, even if this is a custom. So if I make this a custom, and I put a bunch of random points out here and I come to flip, it will flip it upside down. The reverse has been here a bit longer, and that just reverses it across the XY axis and flips it up down the vertical axis. So a kind of a quick way just to manipulate the value curves, create maybe derivatives of your previous value curves. And I think I demonstrated that in my last video, or maybe it was a seminar I was trying to show something. Include 3D objects in package sequence. What does that mean? So I've got some 3D objects here. I do actually have my house here. It's hidden. But when I package a sequence, when I take something like this sequence, I'll call it DDD just because we're lazy. And if I come up here and do a tools package sequence, and I create that, that zip file, and then if I go into Windows Explorer, to my desktop folder we happen to be in at the moment, we'll see that it created that package sequence there. Well, if you look inside the package sequence, there is now, and it's lost because I didn't have it in my show folder, this is just one of my test folders, but you can see that it's brought in my house OBJ, the MTL, and the two image files that make up the cladding on the model are now brought into the package sequence. So if someone shares a sequence and their house happens to be in 3D and they've got mesh objects and everything else, those things are now included in the package sequence, so that you'll again get to see exactly how things work. So that's 2019.4. I guess the cube model was probably the big one, and a bunch of and the FPP Connect Dialog and a couple of minor enhancements in there. 2019.5 was primarily fixes. There was one change, a very subtle change, and that was up here. If you right click and do upload to controller and do the output, Joe Hinkle has come along and added the xLights controller here as a controller that you can upload to. Now, because of the way the xLights work, he doesn't separate out the input definition. There's just one upload, much like the Pixelite and the like, where it uploads everything that's required for the controller in one upload just there. Now, I don't have an xLights controller, so I can't demonstrate it. I'm sure at some point Joe or his vendor will put some videos out and explain to people how to use that in more detail. There's no user interface because, like all of the other controller uploads, it'll give you a warning and then it will just go and work everything out and push the data up to the controller, and it'll give you the similar sorts of errors, no doubt, to some of the others. So let's go to 2019.6. Not a huge amount in this release. There was a change to the spinner model, just a minor change. A user was looking to have a much more hollow spinner, and so now this hollow percentage can go, I think it's as high as 80% now, for those that really want a hollow spinner. We did add the sphere model. It's actually been in xLights for a long time, but not been easily available. So that's there now. Bring it forward. Need to bring it forward. Okay, so there's now this the sphere model. Some people may have noticed that these boxes are now slightly transparent as well, which is kind of useful if you're if you've got a single line model and you want to see the pixels in the middle. You can now actually see inside the cubes. I'm sure we'll come across that in a minute. Anyway, there's a sphere model here. The thing about the sphere model is that it's actually not that interesting of a model other than obviously its appearance. It's always vertically wired. There is no horizontally wiring the sphere model, mainly because it doesn't, to be honest, make a huge amount of sense unless you're going to do different numbers of pixels, and then the model turns into a real basket case of wiring, and it's a mess to set up. So at the moment, it's just vertical. You have a number of strings and a nodes per string. It's actually a matrix behind the scenes, as you would expect. You do the node layout, and it's just a very simple vertical matrix. Which is how we've always recommended people sequence a sphere, but now it actually looks like a sphere. The start location is the bottom at the back. Well, it's either at the bottom at the back in the middle, or it's the top at the back in the middle, and you can obviously go left or right, just like you could a matrix. It's like a matrix has been laid over the front of a ball and wrapped around it, and that's how it kind of works. Other than that, the sphere model is not that interesting. Obviously, things like per preview and the like look kind of cool and a lot better than you could have done with the previous ways of sequencing a sphere. But other than that, it's not that interesting. Acceleration. Actually, let's take this out of 3D mode because it's a little easier to see. You've always been able to move models with the keyboard. You could press the arrow key and you can see it's making little moves. Well, now if you hold it down or you press the key really fast, it accelerates. So it starts off moving very small, but if it gets a certain number of moves within a half second, it starts to accelerate and move faster. And if you want to wait half a second, then you can start making small movements again. That works well. Also, if you've got multiple models selected, you can do the same thing. So it's a little easier just to move models around, which is kind of cool. Now, jumping ahead, this came in a slightly later release, but you can also do this in 3D. You can select one or more models as you want, and you can press the arrow key and move them around. The thing that's changed, and this wasn't in 0.6, this was a little bit later, but if you move the view around so you're looking at the side, when I press the up arrow, it goes up and down, but now when I press the left and right arrow, it goes front to back. But when I move and look at it from the front, and I press the left to right arrows, it now moves side to side. So the keyboard is now aware of exactly which way the camera is looking and is able to cater for that. So even when I'm looking at the back, I press the left and it moves to the left as I look at it rather than left from the front of the model. And that makes it a lot more intuitive to use the keyboard to move models around because you don't have to worry about your orientation anymore. Anyway, that was 2019.6. 2019.7 is when the enhancements really started to take off again. So there's a number of things in here. One thing that's kind of cool is the ability. So let's go to our matrix. Let's insert multiple layers. Yeah, that sounds good. Okay, let's make this a single strand. Okay, and let's come up to the buffer and make that, we'll do thirds. We'll do the left third, and then we'll copy it, we'll paste it. Let's slightly offset it. Slightly offset it. This one we're going to make it the middle third, and this one here we're going to make this one the right third. But let's say I look at that and I go, oh, it's kind of okay, but that's morph, right? And I actually don't want it to be morph. I actually meant to make that single strand. So now what you can do is you can come in here and select all of these models. And if you come over to this drop down here, you can right click here, do bulk edit, come down, choose single strand, click OK. And now it's changed them all into single strand. But the cool thing about it is, and this is not true if you change it just here using the regular drop down, is that it actually kept the buffer settings over here. So all the settings on these top panels didn't change when I changed it from a single line to a morph. And so if I want to go back to a morph again, just come back, bulk edit, make it a morph. Right, and it's still going to have that same look to it. So you can now bulk change effects. And this is kind of cool because you can imagine you could set a preset up, maybe just using simple on effects with the various sub buffers or whatever you want to use. And then you could apply those as a preset and then go in and choose which effect you actually want to use with that buffer shape or with that particular palette or something. So it offers some interesting ways to make yourself more efficient if you're doing lots and lots of sequencing. Okay, jump a few, J1 sys load. Okay, so this is in the setup tab. So we've always had, or for a long time, have had the upload to the J1 sys. Like the xLights, it's here. That's always been there. In 2019.7, I did substantially rewrite the P2 one to enable it to both enforce the configuration rules on the P2 more properly, and also to support all of the latest models that now are able to be uploaded. So, you know, the ability to upload models where you have individual start channels set on different strands, or custom models with multiple strings, all of those things which the J1 sys code was written before that stuff was available. That's all been updated now, at least for the P2. When I lay my hands shortly on a P12, I'll update it for the P12 as well. I still need to get to the SAN devices and the xLights. I have those boards, I just haven't done that work. The Falcon and the xLights and the Pixel Stick are already done. So they already handle all of those use cases. So that was the J1 sys one. The next one I actually showed you. So one of the big challenges when you're getting into 3D or even into 2D, when you're zooming out and whatever, it's kind of like, well, I want to go back to how it was when it started. And so there's now this reset here, which will reset the camera position back to its default position. So that is actually the camera's default position. And you'll notice there's no green box here anymore like there has been in recent releases. And that's because there's now a 2D bounding box here that you can click and show it optionally. And so you can see, I've drawn models all over the place, but when I reset the camera, it brings the green box back to be the size of the screen. So yeah. And while I'm here, there is this X0 is center. What that does is that just centers the screen differently on the model, and it kind of makes the 2D layout look more like the 3D layout, so that when you're in 2D, it looks proper compared to the 3D. Again, you have a reset in here as well, which takes it all back to the default. So that's the reset. We talked about the green box, the cube and the 3D sphere. So one thing I didn't show is one of the things you can do with the cube model is you can, like most models, you can export it as a custom model, and then you can actually load it into the custom model editor and start to edit it. You can do the same thing with the globe. It tends to produce pretty large models, I've got to say. But you know, if you really want to do it, you can export this as a custom model. We'll call it sphere, that's fine. And now it's a custom model and you can go and manually edit it. Maybe you want to renumber it. So you want to use the layout, but you want to renumber all the nodes. Or maybe you are doing a horizontally band globe and you want to delete some of the nodes and make it so that they're more spread out and renumber them. But you don't want to have to draw the thing from scratch. And so that kind of gives you a bit of a head start to it. I'll come back and talk about the 3D model itself as well. I have also made it more obvious when things are locked in 3D. So if I come into this cube and lock it, sorry, I think I unlocked it. Lock it, you can see that it draws it now with a red box, so it's more obvious. And when you don't have it selected, you can mouse around. And it's much more obvious which models are locked and therefore not movable than which things are available to be moved, etc. Once you select them as well, it also, on something like a single line, I think. So if you lock this, yeah, so the red cells, the red boxes are on each end of the line as well, which makes that a little bit easier as well to see. So that's the locking. The 3D custom model, this is the one I actually shared, and I believe it's actually in the Bosqueo store now as well. So this is a 3D custom model. It's a classic custom model. The difference is the custom model dialog now has a depth field, and so this is not just a 11 by 11 grid, but it's also got another 10 grids sitting behind it. And so when you look at the front grid here, you can see that pixels 53, 54, 55, and 56, 57 are on this layer. Now, the purple cells here, what that's doing is telling you or giving you a hint that if I was to look at layer 2, that's where there would be pixels on layer 2. And so you get that hint of what's on the next layer when you're editing this layer. And when you're on this layer, you can see both with the purple pixels what's on the next layer, but the red pixels, you can see what's on the layer behind you, so back on layer 1. And then you get to the green pixels, and the green pixels means that there's one on the next layer and one on the layer before. So it takes a bit of getting used to the colors, but it just gives you that hint about what's going on, because one of the things you'll find is, unless you've got some pretty good spatial skills, building these 3D custom models is a bit mind-bending. It's definitely a lot easier if you've got the prop actually in front of you and you can start to work out, well, which pixels are where when in the different layers. But that's basically how the 3D model works. You have to you split it up into layers and then put each pixel into a layer and into a position in 3 dimensions. But once done, it actually does look like that. That does look like my Bosqueo present, and it's wired up exactly the way my Bosqueo present is. And then you can go off and you can do the classic submodels the way you always done them, and view them then in 3D in your preview. So that's a 3D custom model. Of course, you can also now import the sphere model that we just imported or we just created. So to make that a little bit bigger, you can see that's actually that sphere model. Ooh, that's very big now. And if I go into the model data of that sphere model, it's going to be a little hairy. It's got 21 layers. It's 21 by 21 by 21. Now there are a couple of things here. If you hold down, I think it's Control Shift and page down, you can actually page down through the layers and see the layers. The other thing is, as you move around the grid using the arrow keys, as you go through the layers, it knows where you are. And so it keeps the cursor in the same place, which tries to make it a little bit easier to move. Control right, left, up and down jumps to the next pixel. Control Shift selects, etc. So yeah, there's a bunch of stuff going on here to try and make things a little bit easier to use. But that's what a globe looks, or a sphere looks like once it's been exported as a custom model. You can see that it would be very hard to build one of these manually, but it wouldn't be that hard to start removing pixels out of particular layers if that's what you needed to do. So it may be a way to build still a custom model, but start with something. Okay, now there's a number of other changes that Dan's made around about this time to improve performance. My house here actually doesn't have that many meshes, in many faces, so it's pretty easy. But if you're using a drone deploy and you're bringing in models with thousands of polygons, there has been some improvements in the last few releases which make those things much, much faster to move around and navigate, etc. So yeah, it's a bunch of those. Dan did some changes to the Mac Touchpad, and he also added some event handling. So one of the things he also did was, if I click on this matrix here, I can actually pan and view in this window as well. That wasn't previously possible. Obviously, I can do it down here as well. But yeah, you can pan and zoom, etc., up on the model window as well now. That also came. And then Tyler. Tyler came along and implemented a change to the star model where he made it possible for you to change the inner and outer ratio of the star. Historically, it's always just been fixed at this magic ratio of 2.62. But you can now make your stars have sharper points or less sharp points. I guess you can get it almost to a pentagon if that's what you want to have. It's still a classic star. You can still have your multiple layers. You can still make it a 40, 30, and 20 layer star and so forth. So classic star model, but now you just get some control over the ratio and you can make it a little bit different. And that brings us up to the end of 2019.7. Still lots to go. Actually, what I might do is at this point, I might cover off the xSchedule items, and then I might break the video and I might come back to 8 and 9 because there's a bunch of stuff in 8 and 9 as well. The changes in xSchedule have been much more subtle. But as usual with xSchedule, they're also a little bit harder to show. One of them is here in the text effect, where you can now actually put in a carriage return. Classic programmer style, it's cryptic, it's a /n, which is a new line. And so if I want this to say hello world across 2 lines, the text is going to say hello, and then I'm going to put a carriage return and then world. And if I play that particular sequence, I thought I had why not have a virtual matrix? I don't. I thought I had a virtual matrix. Let's make it 50 by 50. Well, let's make this one 50 by 50. And now you can see, I mean, you can't see because it's off to the side, but as hello and world are on separate lines, which is what the carriage return does. So you can put that into your text now. The other two things, are much harder to show because they relate to xSchedule running as a remote, which some people do. Some people run multiple xSchedules on machines to control particularly very distributed shows. And there's a couple of things that have happened there. So one is all of the remote code has entirely been refactored to make it a lot cleaner. There's some fairly significant bugs, particularly with the ArtNet and the MIDI timecode have been fixed, and I believe they're working pretty well now. The other thing that's changed in there is there's now some new settings. So the modes look quite different up here. It's now just test, master, and remote. And then within master, you can select one or more of these master modes. And you can actually have multiple of them turned on, and it will actually send out over multiple different protocols, so synchronization protocols. So you can choose to have something you're controlling via MIDI and something you're controlling via FPP, and that'll work fine. The remote, you can only have it listening to one remote protocol. It doesn't make sense to have multiple. But you can choose one in here or have it disabled. You can also have it in remote mode and in master mode at the same time. And what will happen in that circumstance is it will listen to another master, but having heard that where it needed to be up to, it will then send out as a master to yet other remotes. So in theory, you could use it for synchronization protocol, transformation or translation from one protocol to another. There's a couple other things in here. There are some things in the configure dialog now. So you can now also set an offset. So if you know that the latency between your master and your remote is 20 milliseconds, you could set the remote offset here to be minus 20 milliseconds, and it will just assume that when that packet arrives that it's out of whack, or plus 20 milliseconds. You'd assume that it's out of whack, and that stops it trying to set it to the wrong time. There's also an ignore jitter. So this is kind of like the maximum amount of milliseconds that you don't mind it being out of sync without it adjusting anything. And that can be really powerful if you get, it's called jitter, which is slight variations in the transmission times on your network. Putting in a jitter setting, ignore jitter setting, can stop it from jumping forwards and backwards a lot and generating not such a nice playback experience. So those new remote settings are in there. So yeah, whole bunch of new things there around remotes, etc. And that brings us totally to the end of 2004, 5, 6, and 7. So I'm going to cut the video here, and then I'm going to pick it up and we'll cover 2019.8 and 2019.9. Thanks, guys.